Hi everyone, we're super happy to have you on this session hosted by NEWFORUM under the umbrella of graph and liminal research. This panel is an open diary conversation about the intersection of technology, human thriving, and meaning making that our guests have been key players in. It's going to focus on how we can rebuild meaning within society and have the right governance structures that benefit us in the long term, with the question of where do we go from here and what kind of specific actions can we take to make things happen. And our panelists are Ellie Hain. She's an artist, researcher, and cultural strategist working on new imaginaries and ideologies for the post-industrial age. Jordan Hall, who's a serial entrepreneur, lawyer, and co-founder of Civium project and fascinated by the idea of economies and societies as a whole that can be disrupted by technology. And also Joe Edelman. He's a philosopher, sociologist, game designer, and entrepreneur. Hi, everyone. Please introduce yourself and let us know how you got into the meaning-making space. Jordan, do you want to quickly introduce yourself?
I'm not very good at that. How about Joe? Would you quickly introduce me?
Yeah, Jordan is a really nice guy, and I've known him for around 2009 or something. There's something around then. We've been through a lot since then, both of us.
That's really amazing. Can you how would you describe him in 3 words maybe? Can you
real words? Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, actually this comes from Ellie. He's a kind of a complexity shaman, kind of and also like a very psychologically insightful.
Yeah. And one of the things that I like about Jordan is that he combines being really smart, but also kind of really poetic and still managing to be strategic, which kind of usually when you're so poetic, kind of this thing. So yeah, he's also been helping us and advising. So yeah, glad to be in conversation with him and you all.
Poorly, but with good intent.
Joe, do you want to also quickly introduce yourself?
Yeah, I guess I'll just say, you said something about how society needs to be rebuilt on meaning. I have a talk called Rebuilding Society on Meaning. So it's good that I'm here.
I guess so. I'm happy that you're here. So let's get straight to it. The first topic that came to our mind when I was researching and I was going through all of the material that all of you guys have been part of is what does it mean to thrive as a human and as a community, and also how do we design our life and our systems? And the question for me is the first thing would be, how does the ideal governance design look like? What has been working in terms of coordination? I know you've been studying this space, so I would love to know what has been the experience so far. Maybe Ellie, if you could start with your experience, that would be amazing.
Yeah. It's an interesting question that comes at a timely time, because I find myself, I think others maybe here were in Suzalu, and the topic of kind of coordination and future of governance is very central. And even though the premise here is sort of the network state, we have a slightly different vision for what the future of governance is. I think a lot of the network state ideology comes from this vision of vote with your feet, not with your voice. So kind of exit, not voice. And our vision is actually the opposite. I think it comes from a similar place, a desire for higher participation and kind of more decentralized, local forms of governance where you feel your input is actually valid. But we take a different approach in the sense that it's true that right now how we do voice is completely devoid of any meaning, right? Current governance, we call democracy, and it means we put this kind of paper in a vote every 4 years and hey, no, you're heard. Obviously that, that's not ideal. But we think, okay, what are the things that make governance meaningful, or kind of what are meaningful experiences that we've had in coordination? And then we try to kind of get really granular on what these things are. That's kind of our method for values elicitation. That comes from kind of lived experiences. I think that's very important. It's not just kind of a pure kind of abstracted ideology, but comes from things that people are already doing. And what we envision as this kind of coordination and future of governance is having people have really high resolution profiles of their meaning profiles, things that they care about, and voting in kind of situations in situations where instead of voting, kind of like doing like deliberation and them kind of putting arguments and morally for example, like morally contentious questions on, is abortion right? Or like, how should we govern this situation? Instead of kind of like just staying at the argument, when I have like people from like different ideological backgrounds and like cultural backgrounds input their arguments and things that they care about, and from that elicit the underlying values in the way that we define them.
Yeah, it's something I really love. When I first watched your videos, there was one where you said it's not just about the talking, but it's also about the action and learning from these actions, and really, like you said, the granular steps that we can take. So Jordan, I would love to hear from your side, like being in the space for so long, let's say observing humans and human behavior and communities, like what has been working or what does it need to thrive as a human today?
Well, let me make two introductory caveats. The first is that I'm almost certainly very, very wrong. And so I would recommend using your discernment at a very high level and taking the very small amounts of useful stuff that happen to usher forth from my mouth and taking those and being very good at throwing away the rest. I do my best to not be as wrong as I can be, but I tend to be wrong more often than not. Second, my sense is like if we were able to step back or be like, take a historical perspective on the world we live in, we'd be remarkably surprised by how crazy the world we live in is, meaning how far away we actually are in our social environment from the kinds of ways of life that are really well suited for human thriving. We've normalized a shocking level of insanity. So given those two caveats, and again, the second is conditioned by the first, my sense of things is that we can begin by the simplest stuff and work your way up. If you actually, for example, it's just a simple thing like find out the people and places and things that you love the most and spend more time on them. If you notice and do a very simple assessment like that, most people will find that they are not spending their time on the things they value the most, or more importantly, the people they value the most and the quality of relationships with those people they value the most. And it's very weird. Like if you think about it from the point of view of like, just take a developmental perspective over the long arc of time. So the ordinary human ways of being, like indigenous 30,000 years ago and back. And you spent time with people. You built very long relationships under large degrees of context that had stake. Right? The choices you made mattered. People lived or died based upon the quality of the choices that you made. You also spent a lot of time with place. You became intimate with all the different aspects of the place, the animals, the plants, the water, the soil, the wind. And there was an intimacy, like a real intimacy of relationality that was available in that context. And, you can take a wide variety of different ways of speaking it, but the basic sense is that's the foundation, right? That kind of a context is a foundation where we're most supported in being able to connect with the things that we are most oriented towards or more capable of getting that rich, deep, thick, enduring value where at the end of our lives we'll look back and say, yeah, that was pretty sweet. That was a good thing. So to the degree to which we can actually create spaces to protect and to recover those possibilities, we can actually really have long relationships that are rich and deep and go across, real trouble and still manage to survive. And where you can have a felt sense of connection to a place where you actually really do have I'm planting a tree that I will not sit under the shade of, but I can still choose to do it, right? That's very, in some sense, very simple and very ordinary, but I would orient it towards those first and then work outwards from there. Now, there's a lot of other things, right? Being human is a very complex problem, but I would orient in that directionality.
That's really interesting because I saw your interview with Kevin Awoki and you talk about the neocortex, and you also talked about the failure of voting and coordination failure. And it seems like we're living in such an abundance of like technology, of different things we can tap into, but we're not getting it right. And I feel like you just mentioned, is it going back to the basics? Is it investing more in the right technology, in the right communities? What is the solution to like the crisis or like the coordination failure we're facing? I mean, it's a very hard answer, but if there would be one person to ask this, I feel like I would ask you,
Well, one thing that I feel pretty good about, which was maybe the only real insight in the Civium arc that I think is solid, is that I propose that we are living in the first moment in the last 10,000 years where there was a binding in the context of the city, which then became this whole of civilization, right? The whole of civilization, from my point of view, is in some sense the city and its adjuncts. So there's a binding between the work of the noosphere, the work of generative creativity, of which technology is a piece, and the work of human living. So humans lived in cities, and we were concentrated into this highly artificial environment because we needed to get people in close proximity to get the most out of our collaborative capacity. But we now are living in an environment where that binding is no longer obligatory. For the very first time, perhaps, in ever, where we can do the thing we're doing right now. Like, I don't live near you, and yet we're talking. And that opens up a lot of interesting possibilities, because now I can do the old render unto Caesar what is Caesar's and render unto God what is God's. I can actually do both of what you just said. I can focus my time and energy and attention on regenerating my embodiment and my human relationality with other people in sort of an embodied fashion by choosing to do so, like putting myself in a context and investing vertically in that context. And I can also orient my time now to a more, let's say, pure is the sense of it, like a more clear or clean generative collaboration. And there's a reciprocal support. Right? As I'm actually more grounded, embodied, healthy, less anxious, more met in lots of different ways, but I'm not projecting that into the technological realm, trying to get my sort of, let's say, I have an ordinary relationship need, but I'm not getting it met in the embodied. So I'm going to project it over here and invent, whatever, some fucking AI thing that's ultimately highly dysfunctional, but because I'm trying to ask it to solve a need over here that's not being met, and that kind of a thing. If I can actually be a healthy human, I can maybe participate in the collaborative development of healthy technologies, or at least relate to technologies in a way that is healthy. You get the distinction there? Like moving at a pace that really works and taking the proper time to allow these things to be well understood and settled into our environment and not constantly get churned under by newer and newer things that we haven't even responded to and adapted to properly. So I would say in some sense, it may have to be both. And the possibility of both is meaningfully present if we operate with some level of intention and effectiveness.
I think coordination failures in general are solved with new forms of articulacy. So one of the amazing powers of language is it lets us cohere around, some conceptual thing that could conceivably be good for all of us. And one interpretation of intellectual history is that we've struggled at different points and then developed some new set of concepts that allow us to kind of talk to each other and set a course in a more sophisticated way. And that's kind of like what Ellie and I are trying to do with meaning and values is that we think that if we can become articulate on this kind of new level, then there's a whole family of coordination failures we can fix.
Ellie, back to you. I think you working on this, like Joe just mentioned, what are some practical actions that you think we can take? Like, what are some things where you have found some meaningful actions and alignments where you say, okay, this is how we can move forward from here?
Yeah, maybe to answer your question and to add to what Joe said, part of the reason why we're thinking of such society-wide coordination failures is because we're not coordinating around things that really matter to us. That's what we call values or meaning. But sometimes I also use the term the underlying reasons of our actions. And when you actually speak to someone that you seem, imagine whatever, a Republican or kind of someone who feels extremely different to you, if the only image that you have of them is kind of their external, kind of more shallow expression, it's really easy to feel aversion towards them. But imagine if you kind of sat down and kind of okay, these ideas that I kind of seem to disagree so much, kind of what's really driving you? Kind of what's the reason underneath all your visions of the good life that feels so different from my visions of the good life? And what you find, and we've run some experiments around these on COVID policy, for example, but we've also heard from other people who have done similar experiments. And what you find is that people actually really see each other and empathize, even when they share, even when they don't share the values. I was talking with this a non-binary person who was on a trip to Alaska with their partner, who's also a non-binary person. And they were talking to a fisherman from Alaska, who's kind of a big time kind of Republican and Trump supporter. And he really cares about salmon and preserving the salmon and the wildlife. And it's really funny because you see this kind of completely different sets of people, but they were telling me how they really connected. And even, they live in the Bay Area. They're kind of urban, artist people. They, they don't care that much about salmon, but kind of seeing what drives people is always kind of a really beautiful experience that generates much more understanding and empathy. And not just that, but kind of you start seeing how these sort of fills up kind of like creates like the moral graph, you start seeing kind of like how people's like different like interests and orientations and ambitions is actually what kind of like makes every kind of like piece of society be attended to, and how this is actually important. Obviously, this is very hard to do at scale. Like it would be very easy to say like, oh, everyone should kind of like go find someone that they disagree with and, spend like a beautiful afternoon talking about your deeper motives. That's beautiful. I wish we can do something like this one day. But right now, this is hard. And this is why what Joe and I focused on is in creating tech right now assisted by AI and LLMs that are able to elicit this deeper meaning and values and reasons from underneath corpus of text or social media, and sort of like creating the tools that can help people like explore this universe of meaning in a way that's like already embedded in how we use media and tech today.
So kind of like have people listen to each other and see what kind of their good life or self-actualization looks like and their needs maybe, or like how does...
Well, yeah, it's beyond people like talking to each other. It's kind of like trying, at least understanding that kind of the objects that we're coordinating around, they're like very surface level, like very shallow. They don't really get to like what's actually true. And kind of like once people, even, when they kind of like interact with everyone, even if they don't have the conversation, kind of like bearing in mind that kind of like beneath everything that they hear, there's kind of like always some truth. And if they try to listen to the truth, when there's at least some disagreement, it becomes like much easier to coordinate. And then obviously building the tools to make that coordination easier, which is our part.
Can I try something that was just coming into my mind as I was listening?
Go ahead.
So I think that there's an older language in the psychology literature, but maybe maps. Like there's a vocabulary that maybe helps her, where you would have something like identity, and then you would have something like self. And identity to identity relationship is the one that is almost intrinsically going to have conflict built in, whereas self to self relationship has a very different sensibility. And what I hear Ellie talking about is a technique that allows people who frankly are modern people, frankly quite locked into their identity construct, to actually be able to both orient towards their self and also be able to be in relationship with other people from a self dimension. And Joe's made this point very specifically, so and other people, my friend Forrest Landry as well, the essential argument literally at a metaphysical level about the nature of reality is that things like goals or objectives or purposes have a characteristic of rivalry, whereas things like values have a characteristic of non-rivalry or even anti-rivalry. And so I can share all of Ellie's values without the least bit diluting my own values, whereas our goals can actually be in conflict. In fact, in many cases, will be in conflict at some limit. And that's a distinction, like an ontological distinction. And if we orient our relationality from the things that are intrinsically anti-rivalrous, then we can actually be in a real relationship, by the way, at a deeper level, from which we can then have a possibility of engaging in a collaborative expression of a new form of goals and objectives that have the only real as something like coordination.
If the object that you're coordinating around is like, I want a toy, I want a truck, I want the doll for myself, then it's very easy to get into conflict. If you kind of like look at the underlying values or reasons, you see that, oh, I want to play and explore and grow and learn about myself as I interact with my environment. And like, that's in essence, much less rivalrous that I need the doll, right? I want a doll. That doesn't mean that at some point, like there might be a natural conflict of resources, like that does happen and there are like very legit reasons for it. But the language that we use for like how we coordinate like does shape a lot. Also because the objects, kind of like our desires or goals or preference or objectives, are much easier to be co-opted by status games or by ideologies or by social pressure than actually our kind of like truest, deepest values and desires are.
Yes.
So I think this is also kind of like what capitalism and kind of like late modernity create around like good jobs. I call it kind of like the one game. We create kind of like a sort of like a scarcity of like what the career is. Everyone there is kind of like really miserable, kind of like no one really likes it, but it's like very hard to like get out. And this is because like the object level desire has been co-opted by a status game. That hurts everyone.
Can I throw something out there that is actually very new or interesting for me that may have relevance in the current context? I was looking at the work of a gentleman named Michael Levin, who's a researcher in what he calls scale-free cognition. And which means he looks at how cognition shows up in some sense, invariant to particulars. So across a wide variety of different scales down to, I don't think he goes down to the quantum level, but certainly the molecular level and up. And one of the points he was making that was quite interesting to me was talking about during the process of the development of an embryo, as different stem cells begin the process of converting into actual tissues. It's relatively stochastic. So the fact that a stem cell turns into, say, a piece of cardiac tissue or a heart cell doesn't mean that it's actually in the right location in the developing embryo. It might actually be over here when it needs to be over here. And its ability to move is blocked by the other cells that are around it. But they're cells, right? They don't actually have an articulacy to solve the coordination problem of how does this cell move to the place it needs to be. And yet, as it turns out, all of us are the successful navigation of trillions of those cells actually figuring out how to solve that coordination problem, lacking any effective real language for doing it. And one of the primary techniques, this is the punchline right here, is stress. One of the things that happens is that when the cell is not in its proper location, it emits generic signals of being at stress, which generic signals are operating at a very low basic level. All the cells around it receive that generic signal, and one of the things that happens is they then begin to also become stressed by the signal of stress adjacent to them, which causes them to emit a stress signal. And there's a very low-level protocol that when the stress level reaches a certain point, the cells actually begin to increase the liminality of their motion. And an increase in the liminality of motion actually allows the original cell the freedom of migration that it needs to have to move to a new location. So it's a fluidity, and let's say in the human level, it would be a fluidity in the social and cultural level would be a product of this emergence, what are effectively generic stress signals. I would say my sense of it is that all of us are feeling the stress of the fact that we are not in the right place, that the world we're living in is actually not where we need to be, how we need to be, and quite often who we need to be. But we express it in the way we express it, right? In some sense, almost randomly. Right? However it comes out is the way that our particular system has the capacity to convert that inchoate, not clearly articulable need into a field, and it produces a general field of stress. And we all feel it, right? All over the place. One of the characteristics is that it begins to move the entire social field into a phase transition to a level of liminality, which, by the way, is also quite similar to chaos, that will have a fluidity that will allow a mass migration into new modes of being that it's quite more, how would I say, more pluripotent than what we have become used to. So I would just say, put that out there as an interesting possibility of something to kind of keep your eyes open for. We might find ourselves crossing that chasm. And it might, by the way, feel very alarming because it will, in fact, again, it is chaos in both senses, right? The generative chaos and the risky chaos at the same time. But if you relate to that from a particular location, to relate to it as generative or potent or having possibility of a much higher level of generativity than the current environment. If you relate to it in a different way, then you'll panic. And that will actually potentially be harmful to you and those around you.
Just to add that kind of like the model of cultural evolution that we operate under our project is the notion that the higher the complexity a system is, the more granular the notions of what's good we need in order to be able to like coordinate around. And kind of like in order to like live into complexity, you need more stress. And right now, kind of AI risk and existential risk in general, it's just this kind of like stressor for us to be like able to kind of like get our shit together and kind of like find these kind of like more concise notions of what's good, like this articulation of the good that we call meaning, in order to be able to, for us to leap into this like higher level of complexity. And that's not even bad. Like that's just kind of like the normal process of evolution. And it's just like, how are we going to write it?
Yes, I want to actually go there because you're talking about AI and I really want to bring this in. So what does it look like to create trust? So, you know, we are all creating our identities and we're all being part of kind of like these online systems and systems in general. And what role does signaling your identity and creating trust play in creating a thriving economy? And also, who are you signaling that trust to? What are the qualities you're attributing to? And what kind of skills and creative values are we like defining here? Like how does this look like? And with AI especially, how do we use that, or how do you differentiate there?
I think there's probably like a really good and complicated, complex technical answer to these, of some sort of kind of like new reputation systems that like float the right information and the right people and kind of like leave legitimacy online in a different way. That is kind of like the solution that we need for the new paradigm. I don't really know how that solution looks like. I hope someone is working on this, but I'm going to talk at like the individual level and like the relational level. And I think that what we need to develop, because like right now we're just going to see, as you all were saying, kind of like a lot of potentially misleading AI generated content that's kind of like meant to kind of like distract us. And for me, the best way that I've kind of like found of like navigating these, and not just kind of like AI generated content, but generally like a time of like a lot of uncertainty, is trying to like really pay attention to your intuition and kind of like what feels right. And not kind of like your immediate feeling, because like your immediate feelings are deceptive, but kind of like your really kind of like reflected deeper intuition. And that's kind of like for the people that you want to trust, for the projects that you think are like worth listening to. And then kind of like curating kind of like close circle of kind of like people that you trust, that you can kind of like throw the information around. And then like you're still open, right? Like you're still on Twitter and so on. But I think paying attention to like the signals that our like body emits is usually kind of quite powerful, like ancient tech.
I noticed a desire to make some distinctions just to see if they help produce a bit of clarity. And I'm feeling like the distinctions that we've been making so far continue to show up as being useful. So I would say, for example, just to make some simple terms, I would use the word signal at this higher strata of identity and objectives and purposes, and maybe things like expression at the level of self and values, and notice that those are different. So the word trust is ambiguous. In some sense, the word trust means like, do I trust that the pilot knows how to fly a plane? Almost an objective assessment of objective capacity, which will be objectively measurable in the sense that the plane flies or it doesn't. Well, do I trust my wife? Well, that's a very different kind of thing. It's the same word, kind of, same letters, but it means something very different. But if I make this distinction, then it's a little bit cleaner. And so at the level of expression, we're talking about intimacy, of relationality, and where the objective is actually intimacy of relationality, development and expression of self in relationship with other self, in a symbolic relationship with the quality of self qua self, right? Which to say the aspect of wholeness of which we are all a part. Up here, then I have signaling of identity, which frankly is largely at the level of purpose and goal and objective. Will this tool serve the purpose that it is identified to serve? Is this a functionally effective, what do you call it, underwriting laboratories good switch, right? That's a different strata. That strata can and will be handled by some combination of things like blockchain and AI. Very useful, very functional. Databases, provenance, cryptographic signatures to be able to identify continuity, status. So there's a very large number of things that are happening. In fact, the reason why I was a little bit late to our call was I was just chatting with an individual who's working on exactly that problem at that level. And then there's the more fundamental problem down here, right? Which is the problem of how do we actually do this kind of thing? How do we build trust at the level of expression, at the level of self, at the level of intimacy, of relationality? And I think if we're actually able to keep those separate and notice that they are distinct, that'll help. Because if you confuse them, for example, here's a classic problem, the notion of status and its relationship to self. So I have a credential. I went to Harvard. Oh, is that an aspect of myself? Or is that evidence that I have some level of competency and some objective skill? Kind of both, right? It's a weird mix, right? It's a weird thing because what we've done, we live in a society which doesn't allow us to actually have the context of intimacy of relationality at the self-to-self level. So what we do is we simulate that into some other kind of mid-level thing, which I'm going to call an identity. We try to load that identity with the content of self, and then we relate to each other by means of that, and oftentimes get confused between competence and self.
I love that you mentioned credentials and you spoke about this because, we are all living in this world where degrees and certificates and everything matters, like our job, our work. But then there's things that you can't really measure, like creative contribution, or can we measure it actually? How do we measure someone's creative intelligence or contribution in a way that is accurate? Because right now, the system is kind of broken, like the creativity, how we measure creativity and how it's distributed is kind of broken. Because when I see people working for companies, it's usually the people that come up with the creative ideas that don't get the biggest share or voice. So how do we get there? Is there a way to fix this, or is it kind of going to stay the same? Because I think we sometimes humans are repeating these cycles, right? Of like, we follow our goals, we felt greedy to money. There's so much going on. Yeah, I would love to hear some opinion on this if you have. Let's see.
I can share a story which is kind of neat in that direction. And maybe this is, I think, from my experiences, a useful exercise, which is to put things in historical context. Whenever we feel trapped, it's maybe useful to actually put things in a historical context, because one of the things that reminds us is that shit changes. So we're probably not trapped, although we may be in eddy for a moment. And this story has to do with the origin of the rise of the tyranny of the metric, the form of measurement, which is quality reducing, right, towards quantity. And it has to do with corn. Back in the day, before trains, corn was hyper-local. The corn that you had access to was the corn that could be delivered to you more or less by horse, and which meant that your local farmers would bring the corn into a local market, and you would go to that local market and you would sort through the corn with your qualitative evaluation, and you would select the corn that you discerned whether the level of quality that you wanted to pay for. And by the way, the farmer would negotiate with you on the basis of the farmer's discernment of the level of quality that they thought it was going to be. Okay? So this is a very qualitative assessment. At the end of the day, it was produced to some level of metric money, but not entirely, because you're in a community. So relationality is rich, and there's a lot of high-dimensional stuff going on. Right? Perhaps you're actually trying to find a way to, you're creating a relationship with the farmer that ultimately is actually grounded in the fact that the farmer's son and your daughter might actually get married, and you're going to be in-laws with each other. There's a lot going on, okay? When trains enter into the scene, we're now taking that, we're decontextualizing that corn. We're moving out of the local community that has all those qualities to it and moving it to the big city. And we can't actually assess the quality because we don't have the bandwidth of people to do it. So we have to create a normative standard. The corn is all put into a particular silo. Only the corn that meets that standard is allowed. Anything that doesn't meet the standard is just thrown away, so value 0. Everything above that standard is reduced down to value 1. All corn is renormalized to a single standard. An integer value is in or out of the silo, and it is now measured entirely in terms of its weight, and which is a pure metric. And then that is that's fully legible, completely translatable. It can be put to the train, weight can be measured. It can be transported to the new place, weight can be measured, and money can flow across that decontextualized, metricized, quantitative dimension. Now, that was a fundamental, that happened all over the place during the era of the mass, right? So moving in from the 19th century through the 20th century moves to the era of the mass. And more and more of our lives, both in terms of material and economic activity, and in terms of our individual personal relationships, became captured by the tyranny of the metric, the tyranny of the quantitative, which, by the way, is embodied in the context of cryptocurrency, or whatever we want to call it, in the weird, naive assumption that we call them NFTs, because we assume that fungibility is the primary and non-fungibility is a derivative, when in fact reality is the opposite. Those things that are most valuable are intrinsically singular, which is they are intrinsically qualitative, intrinsically non-fungible. And it's only by actually subtracting context and isolating for particular aspects that you're able to produce fungibility for particular objective functions. And that's a perfectly fine thing to do, but it's upside down. I would propose that we are moving ourselves into a new environment. We're moving out of the era of the mass. In this new environment, there's many things that are showing up, not the least of which, by the way, are large language models that have the ability to provide scalability, but also quality instead of pure quantity. And so I would predict, on the basis of a wide variety of heuristics and evidence, that we should expect to actually be seeing a reinvestment of the contextual and the qualitative in all aspects of our lives.
On this question of like, how do we attribute creativity, which I guess is kind of like also a question of like ever more relevance in the age of AI. I would say like, why do you even want to do that? Like everything, you probably know this kind of like phrase, like everything is a remix. And it's very hard to kind of like trace like who actually had like the most original idea, because we get inspired from each other all the time. So now I made a video, Exit the Void, that you guys watched. And part of this video is inspired by like ideas that I had like with Joe, we've been like in conversation for a long time. These ideas are at the same time inspired by like Charles Taylor and also kind of like being part of the internet. And I kind of like pick, like aesthetic inspiration from like different sources. And so, yeah, there is some part, there's like attribution myself, but I'm just kind of like riffing from like a lot of people, and that's just kind of like an integral part of the creative act. In the same way, usually when I get really happy when you told me, oh, I took like all these screenshots of the video and I've been like sharing them with people, and I'm like, yeah, like let them come alive and like let them be shared. Like that's what makes an idea be alive. And so I think what you want is not actually like creative attribution, but you actually want sort of like a just and like equitable world. And I don't mean this in the like necessarily like social justice sense. I know these kind of like words get overused, but it's very easy when you're like in a situation of like scarcity or like extreme hierarchy that then you get like overly attached and sort of like possessive of your creative output. And I understand why that happens. However, I don't think that kind of like trying to like have extreme ownership and protection over that creative output is the ideal solution. I imagine that kind of like in a world where we like all feel like more abundant and like maybe I'm not like a mega fan of like UBI, but kind of like maybe a combination of UBI with kind of like a lot of, social engineering, like societal like restructuring where people feel like they have rich relationships and meaning and like material abundance. We will kind of like implicitly understand that there's kind of like no isolated creative act. And I hope that we will all be like much, much more generous with our ideas about
because I noticed both. On the one hand, I would say almost infinitely more protective. And in the context of that infinitely more protective, infinitely more generous. What I mean is this: if I am expressing something from a very deep place, right, and I'm endeavoring to articulate with whatever articulacy I'm capable, something that is coming from something larger than me, right, that I find highly meaningful, and you want to steal it and use it for bad ends, then I should kill you. I'm infinitely more protected. Like fuck licensing, right? There's none of that. Right? This is a sacred trust. However, if you are participating in the sacred trust, then I should support you wholeheartedly. Right? So it's a completely different relationship to the thing we're doing, and that actually creates both an intensity in both directions. I would say very different than the world we live in.
Yeah, for sure. And it's good that you're pointing this out, because one of the things that Lejo and I are concerned, and we've also like talked about Jordan, about kind of like our current project and vision of like rebuilding meaning, is that if we're successful, there's going to be this kind of like mass movement for like meaning washing, like current, dysfunctional game A Moloch dynamics. And so in this sense, like you do want to be very protective of like the original act and also kind of like integrity that this entails. But yeah, like the ideal paradigm hopefully is a bit more generous if we trust that we're operating from a place of high integrity.
Yeah, this kind of reminds me of those questions around both OpenAI and Uniswap. So in crypto, Uniswap did that gift of giving away their smart contracts as open source. And what happened was someone took those smart contracts, created a competitor, and rewarded people who would remove their liquidity to them, kind of what the banks do, to attract customers. And that's very interesting in that perspective. And I think OpenAI has kind of a similar approach by saying we don't want to open source our stuff. We want to be generous, and they have actually this weird relationship with like we are giving away the models, but actually they collect all these like insights from feedback that makes the model so valuable and capitalize it in the balance sheet of Microsoft. But yeah, anyway, this opens like to me this kind of like considerations of like what do you do about intellectual property that is given away to people who are not necessarily good actors and who could either use it against you in a rivalrous way, or even worse, use it in ways that can be all misaligned.
Yeah, for me the distinction that I've been really liking recently is can be a bit surprising. It's a bit orthogonal, but I think it lands, which is adult and child. And I mean this in a sort of a traditional, like an indigenous sense. That the transition to become an adult is actually quite a significant thing. You didn't just happen to turn 18 and magically you now get these these weird legal rights. You actually have a real validity that you have certain qualities of capacity, a certain level of character, and a certain level of competence to behave in a fashion which allows you to be in relationship with other people. You have high integrity, you have a high commitment to a shared sense of values with demonstrable capacity over long periods of time. You're an adult. Okay, now I can be in relationship with you, which has this reciprocity built in. I can share, I can open source to you because I know that you can be trusted in this fashion to further the things that we are both part of. And if you can't, then you're in the category of child, which may mean you're a wayward child and you need to be trained and helped to be able to become an adult. Or you may just actually be a young child, which you also need to be trained and helped to become an adult with a different set of techniques. But think about that. Sushi Swap ultimately was wayward children, right? That was just an adolescent hijinks at the end of the day by beings who are not yet fully developed to behave in a mature fashion with relationships of reciprocity with other adults. And giving weapons, powerful things to children is historically quite unwise. So that's the way I've been thinking about this recently.
I love this way of thinking, like how it's not necessarily a bad system, but an opportunity for good alignment. And going back to what Ellie said about this, everything's a remix and should it be open? I mean, that's the way that we all came into this conversation, is that it was possible to signal online those things and to find the people that you do align with. And I think that's why identity is such a huge topic to explore here. And for me, it's something that I've been researching for like about 10 years now. I was looking at the concept of meaning making, the role of technology that is influencing society, reading like so many different types of literatures from different cultures and understanding what that process has been in times when it was a technology that was as revolutionary as AI, like producing machines, changing like war and everything. All of that has been documented in the past. And we've seen what the effect is on even the concept of your identity and how that can enable you to find people, things, subjects that you want to ultimately go into. And thankfully, in most of the world, not everywhere in the world, we're able to go more to what the Maslow pyramid of needs is pointing to, is that you can get to your aspiration more easily. And that's this kind of thing that's driving a lot of economic decisions. And your identity is all part of that. I think one of the most interesting pieces of research I would recommend everyone here to look into, it's by George Akerlof and Rachel Cranton, and they talked about identity economics. And that for me is like really explaining our relationship with even understanding what meaning plays in economics. And it's something to think about now in this defining of Web3 and AI, is that I think we've been looking at economics the wrong way for so long, trying to define it into some habits that people do. But actually, it's all around your identity and how are you making decisions, signal to people, find things, and be able to take that lens through solving things like the metacrisis and Web3 and the AI. How can we enable people to understand themselves better and the way that they're perceiving the meaning of their own identity?
I love what you guys are talking about, and also Madeline, what you said. And I think this also goes back, like we come from, with New Life and our background, we come from the world of aesthetics and how even pictures and aesthetics can ship into this, like how much meaning sometimes pictures have, and especially for this generation, and how we can, incentivize content and things that are actually, I feel like there's such a variety of content and things, but how do we actually find the things that are valuable to us? I don't know. I feel like it's really, to our generation, it's so ingrained in us how this plays a role. Wondering, if there's other people that chip in.
Yeah, maybe if I can chip in, Joyce, for education in general, somehow information is better understood when you're taking serious topics and you're transforming them into memes or jokes. Mm-hmm. And it seems to be the best way to communicate to the new generations. So I was wondering, Jordan and Ellie, what is your take really on educating and just the power of memes in general? Because it's something that is very important today, and that's really underestimated, right?
Yeah, I had a year, I think kind of 2 years ago, where I was like really into memes, and I did kind of like a bunch of artwork with memes, and since then they've become kind of like a regular part of my communications, even though I haven't like used them that much on Twitter recently. I mean, I haven't used Twitter that much. I even kind of like we have a deck where we explain like our take on AI alignment, and I like made it all on memes.
I saw actually one of your videos, and I thought it was so funny because you were criticizing kind of sense making and, you know, influencer culture, and you had a bunch of memes in there. And I was like, you were saying that sometimes seeing the memes actually makes so much more sense than having grand words for it.
Memes are like a caricature of like a certain like emotion and idea. They just kind of like hit. What I've done in my work as part of this like cultural strategy is to kind of like map certain like constituencies and like groups that you want to reach, and like see what's the meme that will like get across to these groups better. And you're still, you know, thinking in terms of like evocative objects, but like that can vary a lot depending on like who you want to speak to. And memes are good, but you know, they have a internet memes are good, but they have kind of like a very concrete playing field.
Yeah, I mean, this ties into my next question actually, to Ellie and Joe, which is how do we solve this like polarization that has been promoted by social media? I saw like Joe's video on rebuilding meaning in society, and how do we kind of like fix these like internet games that are played there, and how do we really use AI and tools to reach alignment? Like how do we get there? We are actually living in a crazy world of algorithms and polarization, and I feel like there must be a way where we can use what we're building to solve this. And you guys have an opinion?
I think so. I think there is a way to use what we're building to solve this. Thank God. Yeah, I guess there's a lot of different ways, but the way that I'm pushing, what Ellie and I are pushing right now, kind of pivots around this idea that we're calling wise AI. So one of the problems that's happening is a kind of a lot of information that's not wise. A lot like an overload of sometimes true information, sometimes ideological information, sometimes like all sorts of different kinds of information that's actually just not what would really help us live well. And so we have this like wonderful new, I think it's kind of important, is like LLMs are about to are in the process of exploding onto the scene and weaving themselves into our society and our lives. And this is a point, this is like a pressure point, like an acupressure point, where we can inject some kind of filter and amplification and concern for wisdom. And so that's kind of what we're doing with our Center for Wise AI, which is the latest name for the organization that Ellie and I run.
Yeah. Maybe I'll add 2 points to these. As I said before, talking at the level of values and sources of meaning is inherently much less polarizing, and you know, able to like generate like much more like empathy amongst each other. And we have to like some strategies to, I think, kind of like as we spread these like values literacy, this will help in the direction. But I also want to point out to the fact that polarization is also kind of like a symptom of a problem. The problem is like we're all like extremely dissatisfied with like current circumstances. And I think there's a way of kind of like one society, you know, we like start mending our social fabric and our relationship with each other and like our relationship with ourselves, that polarization becomes, instead of kind of like the problem, it's kind of like how we start kind of listening to each other to like coordinate around like solving these big problems.
I'm really looking forward to this because I feel like this is something that is needed. The AI that I've seen so far is not really has always the best incentives or is built on values, or you don't really know where the data is coming from. So I think it's really important that we align our AI with what we actually want to do. And I know that Jordan has to leave soon, so I would just quickly, to round everything up, have a thought experiment on rebuilding society. And so this question around what if a DAO could decide collectively what it means to be thriving, be a thriving human contributing good to the world, society, and local communities, how would that ideally work? What would you propose to be good behaviors, to signal with your identity, with what you do, and contributing to this? What does it mean as a human? What are the good incentives? What would you say? Where's the basis of this?
So quickly, let me just transmit one meme in the sort of the more abstract sense, and then I'll answer your question in a way that I think is a little bit humorous, for me at least. I agree quite closely with the way that Joe framed it, and specifically on the notion of a moment, right? He called it, I think, a pressure point or an acupressure point, something like that. But it's a moment. There's a window of opportunity with high degree of variance. Like we can actually steer things tremendously during this window of opportunity. But that window closes, and it's not too long from now. So there's a huge amount of weight on making good choices right now. The magnitude of the lever that this AI thing brings is unprecedented in history. It is literally the largest lever that has ever happened. And its directionality will largely be set over the next, say, like 2 to 3 years. So it's actually rather critical that everybody who can puts themselves in the direction of supporting the orientation of that setting in stone, or at least that hardening of the clay, in the right direction. And I agree completely with Joe that we absolutely can design this in such a way that it is furthering the thriving of all things that we value. In terms of signaling, I personally use your children as my primary signaling proxy. So if I interact with somebody and they have children, I try to see, are they good kids? Are they wholesome and healthy and vital and engaging? If they are, then I'm really interested in interacting with the adult that was supporting the production of such a kid. And if they're not, I'll be skeptical of anything else they throw at me.
Does this also relate to projects and or just to children?
Absolutely complete. No. Yeah, just biological children. And by the way, it doesn't matter what project I'm working on with you. Anything at all. If I meet your kids and they're a mess, I'm going to be very, very skeptical of you in any circumstance. If I meet your kids and they're amazing, I'm likely to collaborate with you, even if the thing we're talking about isn't necessarily, obviously, the thing we should be that you're legible at doing.
I'm curious how many kids are absolute messes. But...
About 85% that I've met.
But
we live in a terrible world.
Tragic.
I mean, I can relate because I don't have kids yet, but I really like this, and you bring it back to the human element of things and how we treat each other and how we interact with our peers. But how does this, like, I still want to go there. Like, how do you see, like, envision maybe the ideal community of the internet, the ideal relationship with our identity on the internet? How do you see this? How is this going to be balanced in the future? I really want to come to like some sort of vision or conclusion with this. Or Ellie, if you want to chip in here, would love to.
That's obviously kind of like the longer term vision that I hope it can be manifested, as soon as we can make it happen. But in the meantime, I think what you guys are doing is already kind of like a good example of these. And it's kind of like curating like good like online and offline communities, kind of, even though this community is offline, I broader kind of like sense making. I also know kind of like a lot of people like offline, and some of them are like close friends. And I think something that we humans seem to retain is kind of like the capacity for, somewhat like evaluating characters. Some people do this better than others, and then kind of creating scenes around that. And I think for me, especially kind of like online, something that I really value is like when I have a call with them or when I meet them offline, like how do they show up? And that for me is like a very strong signal of like who do I want to bond with and who do I want to like create with. Sometimes the people who are best online are actually like they're not that great offline, but just people that it intuitively like feels really like in your body to kind of like hang out, to like be around them. Like we know how to do this, like that's how we've like created community all the time. It's just kind of like a matter of like trusting your like sense of for people.
There's this thing that a lot of people say where you should not meet your idol, like if you're an idol fan of some sort of person, because you're likely going to be disappointed. And I think maybe it's really about focusing on the peer-to-peer networks that align with our values and on and offline communities, and use tools like the thing that you're building, identity solutions, and things that really are for the long term, that we can really get there. Because I feel like we absolutely have all the tools, like we are there, we have the capacity to build this. Like, I think
sometimes our work is I forget who said this, somebody this close to us, Ellie, maybe you remember, but somebody said that what we do is the opposite of crypto, because crypto people have focused on trustless systems and we focus on building trust. Right? Like under which circumstances do we trust each other? When do we share values?
There's a question from somebody, I think, in the chat. Can you index the offline relationships online? And can Web3 enable this for more trust for friends or peers of friends? So it's about indexing offline relationships to online.
Yeah.
I mean, most messengers have mostly like
that's what they do, right? That's what messengers do.
Yeah, like messaging apps. Yeah. And I think kind of even, different like social networks, I think kind of like Twitter is, at least how I use it, is in this like very kind of like offline, like you don't have like so many of your like IRL friends in it. But I think kind of like the way that most people use Instagram is as a way of kind of like showing their life and what they're up to their family and friends. Yeah, I don't know about Web3. I guess it might have some good applications, but as we said, like we focus on the trust rather than the trustless stamp. So I'm glad other people are working on the other side of the coin, but outside of my area.
Amazing. Sophie and Madeline, any last thoughts or questions?
Yeah, just one little comment on my side. Thank you so much. It was amazing. I was actually having this like resistance, when I was listening to this pace versus pipeline dichotomy, and I was like, listening to it because I've been, doing digital marketing and stuff like that. And it's very hard for me, right? I think this conversation actually, I made a massive step because I could finally see, and especially I think one thing clicked with what Jordan said earlier about building relationships and how we are actually wired for that level of trust and that level of intimacy. Well, yeah, I think I'm making great progress towards being convincing, even though I'm still like network effect and growth and all of that. I get it, and I appreciate your work, guys. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you for you guys for organizing these and thanks for coming.
I definitely want to follow up and learn more about what you guys are doing also with the AI side. And thank you to everyone who joined and chipped in. And we see Joe eating a lovely salad. I love that, just getting the food. I really like the vibe was really, really great. And you just brought so much insight and for us to reflect as well, and what we want to build and where we go from here, and what does it mean to rebuild a society with meaning. So thank you so much, Ellie. Thank you, Joe, and thank you, Jordan, who's not here anymore. And thank you to everyone who joined. See you guys very soon.